Whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margaret Myers. I am a senior advisor for the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to Tracking China-Caribbean Relations, New Tools and Takeaways. We're very grateful for your participation today in this important discussion on trends in the China-Caribbean relationship and mechanisms for tracking them. Certainly, China-Caribbean relations are evolving in new and important ways and don't often receive the attention that they deserve, given all that's happening in this relationship. So this is an opportunity today for us to delve a bit deeper into this and to understand and use some new tools to begin to understand how the relationship is evolving and how better to track it. I'm thrilled to be joined by, first of all, Alexander Coswell, who is a fellow at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, which has been a critical partner for the Inter-American Dialogue over the past few years as we've sought to do more work on various aspects of China-Caribbean relations, understanding, delving into this relationship and researching in depth some of the trends underway. And also Diane Edwards, who is director of the Professional Services Unit of the Mona School of Business and Management at the University of the West Indies, to provide commentary today as well. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Alexander, who is going to be introducing a new tool to us today, the China CARICOM portal, a very exciting new tool that CAPRI has developed to track various aspects of Chinese engagement with the region. And we'll learn about that, but also some key findings from CAPRI's extensive work to develop this tool and the many months and even years, I think it is, of research that went into producing it. So, Alexander, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margaret. As Margaret said, I am Alexander Coswell. I am a fellow at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, which is an independent public policy think tank based in Kingston, Jamaica. We are located on the campus of the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus in Kingston. And I oversee all this international security, national security, and foreign relations related research. And most of our work in the past has covered Jamaica specifically, but per our mandates, our self-given mandate, we are broadening up to cover the entire Caribbean region. And this is one of our first forays into region-wide research. So this is something we're particularly excited about. And we decided that our first foray will cover a topic that is important for the entire region, which is China's growing relationship with CARICOM states and the region in the whole, but we're focusing down on CARICOM states. So I'd like to introduce the China CARICOM portal. Now, this portal is an interactive visual representation of data that we have collected over the past year on China's evolving relationship with the region. The data covers from 2013 to 2023. And the data set tracks investments across that 10-year, or sorry, 11-year period between China, the People's Republic of China, and CARICOM states. Now, of course, most of the data, or rather all the data, excludes the 5 countries in CARICOM that do not have diplomatic relations with China currently. So those would be countries like Haiti, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and St. Lucia, and Belize, and I won't name all of them, but I'll get into the specific countries that it covers later on. But you can see here that this is Jamaica, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Suriname. And what you're seeing here is a visual representation of the trade, the level of trade that flows between each country and and the People's Republic of China. So we can say high investment, medium investment, low investment. But the data covers more than trade. It covers the data that I'll introduce to you later covers more than trade. It covers aid, trade, and diplomacy, diplomatic engagements between each country and the People's Republic of China. And on the subcategories include construction, health-related activities, education-related activities, and technology. Because what we found in the initial survey was that these are the most represented sectors in the relationship. Now, so one thing we have noticed over time is there's just been a steady rise in the number of projects that China has been carried out in the region. And this trend is especially true as it relates to countries like Jamaica and Guyana, which are very prominent engagement. And there's a steady rise in the level of engagement between Jamaica and Guyana over time. And they have the highest and most consistent level of engagement, whereas countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Suriname also show frequent interactions, but with significant fluctuations in that level of engagement. And then small islands such as Dominica and Grenada and Barbados, they have notably fewer projects, but still show notable engagements, but less frequent. So the data reveals some spikes in engagement over the region, but a lot of these spikes reflect one, infrequent engagement with small islands. But also the data also covers the first 3 years of the COVID pandemic from 2020 to 2023. And so you see a noticeable change in the level of engagement during that period because it's a pandemic. So in terms of construction, so when you click on one of these circles, you're able to see very clearly that construction is heavily represented in the trade between each country. And this is true almost no matter what country you turn to. In Bahamas, it's almost all construction. And that really is the case because we find that this is in the early years of 2013 to the early years of engagement, the relationship starts with construction projects. You see that those continue across time before it branches out into other areas, but I'll get more into that. So construction is a major area of investment with projects focused on public buildings, transportation networks, and housing. Public buildings, to give an example, Jamaica's new building of Ministry of Foreign Affairs was built by the Chinese contractors. But investments were not evenly distributed, but rather concentrated in specific areas, indicating priority-based allocation. Larger scale infrastructure projects are, likely represent a strategic diplomatic shift to strengthen diplomatic ties and economic influence. But beyond construction, you've seen a growth into or a broadening the span of the relationship into investments in technology. Significant projects include high-speed internet expansion, e-government services, digital literacy programs, and because digital infrastructure, you can view this as a key enabler for other sectors such as education and commerce. And the emphasis on digital technology suggests a shift towards long-term digital transformation in the region, which is something that the People's Republic of China is really keen on pushing. In terms of trade and economic partnerships, some years saw no financial investments for many countries, particularly smaller countries of infrequent engagement. And there's a non-linear engagement strategy that the data reveals. But in terms of trade infrastructure and developments, such as, again, port development specifically, suggests increasing interest in facilitating Chinese and Caribbean relationships, but also to fill a gap in the Caribbean's infrastructure needs, because this is one thing that the Caribbean countries have found difficult with economic instability being a consistent trend for CARICOM countries over the last few decades. They've found it infrastructure financing is not just a way to deepen CARICOM China relations, but it's an easy way for China to engage with the CARICOM because there's that noticeable gap in the need for infrastructure and the lack of ideal or affordable solutions for financing it. Now, in health, investments in the health sector largely correspond to the COVID-19 pandemic for more or less obvious reasons. This is, again, it's about filling a need that CARICOM countries perceive at the time and that China perceives that it can assist with. Projects focus on hospital construction, medical equipment supply, public health campaigns. These are all areas that the Chinese have been involved with. But the trend indicates a reactive, like with construction, a reactive strategy rather than a proactive, we want to be involved in the Caribbean health sector strategy. Education initiatives prioritize one of those areas that prioritize digital transformation. Key initiatives include school construction, classroom technology integration, teacher training, and focus on digital learning and infrastructure highlights an effort to modernize Caribbean education systems. But we can also notice the broader trend. There are lots of these are diplomatically driven because there is a reason that there's been little no engagement with CARICOM countries that do not recognize China. One notable exception is Haiti, which is not represented here because it's just one-off engagement where the Chinese were involved at some point in the former UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. So I'll move along. So in terms of long-term strategic engagement, China's involvement in CARICOM countries has expanded beyond traditional infrastructure into technology, digital transformation, education. But short-term investments have responded to particular crises. Well, plugging in gaps, chronic gaps in our infrastructure, but also responding to the needs of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the overall pattern suggests growth in all areas across the CARICOM region, which indicates a long-term trend of to diplomatic push to strengthen engagement between the regions. Now, I want to note that the trade data you're seeing here represents just the trade data, and this data just goes to 2021. But the dashboard includes access to all projects, which the total of 817 projects across the CARICOM region. And you can access them by country or in totality if you went through this filter here. So if I want to see just the projects on Jamaica, and we mark them as completed or ongoing projects, and you can click on them to find the details of each project. The monetary value of the project, the funding agency of the project, the type classified. This particular project, Jamaica Office China, 10 CM, this is the Caribbean Military Maritime Institute scholarships. And you can then view the source of that data or a newspaper clipping telling you more details about that project. And all this data is available for download from the site. But this is just an overview of those projects. So again, we have 815 of these projects, and we allow you to an easy way of viewing the details of each engagement. And then you can, through this portal, you can view a full project inventory, and you can filter by sector, country, type of project, and year. Again, we have 2024 and 2025 here, but the data we have only at this point only goes up to 2023, sorry. But we do have plans to continue updating this dashboard so that it continue to serve as a tool for further research into the relationship between China and the Caribbean, or China-specific Caribbean countries, and to also serve as a kind of public access monitoring tool, because this has become a topic of frequent public conversation and sometimes anxiety over China's growing relationship with the region. And this is one of the ways where we are trying to shed some light on the relationship. So for any interested party, whether they be private researchers, the public sector the public who are just interested in relationship, but also for policymakers in each country to have a central place that they can look and grow and view what other countries are, what kind of projects that China is doing in other countries that maybe one other country wants to see, or vice versa. Just have a central place for policymakers, both local and international, to have a objective evidence-based resource for having informed discussions about China in the region. Thank you, Margaret.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexander. And it's really interesting to see this tool, finally online. And I know I have a lot of questions about, some of the observations that you've mentioned and alluded to. I'll save those for the Q&A, and want to turn to Diane. But before I do that, let me remind everyone online, please do put your questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those in due course. So Diane, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Margaret, and thanks, Alexander, for that expose of the tool. Before I start, I just want to thank the Inter-American Dialogue and CAPRI for staging this conversation, because I think the relationship between China and CARICOM and the Caribbean is of great importance. Just want to add that while I'm at the Mona School of Business and Management now, my previous role for 9 years was at JAMPRO, which is Jamaica's Economic Development Agency. And so I had quite a lot to do with Chinese projects coming into Jamaica and actually taking trade missions into China and helping to foster some of our exports into China. So I have quite a long history and relationship with this topic. I think the tracker is very much welcome, because I think it's really going to add to the body of knowledge around the relationship that is developing much greater strategic importance for the region. China has become one of the major investors in the region, and certainly one of the biggest purveyors of infrastructure and loans. And I think this is something that I think the question of loans should also feature in the tracker. And I know some of the projects will relate to loans. That's what I was going to say. Some of the projects that you have listed on the dashboard will relate to loans. So I think that is also important, because, and I'll get back to that in a minute, some of the controversy surrounds the question of debt. I think also the tracker is going to really provide a repository of information for policymakers, for students, for academics, and the general public, to really shed some light on the relationship and dispel, I think, some of the emotive reactions that we see, some of the almost anxiety and disinformation around the relationship, which sometimes is stoked for political reasons. And I think for investment promotion agencies and trade promotion organizations, this will be really useful in helping them to track this relationship and see what really is going on here. I think in terms of who benefits from the relationship, this is always a question that is, controversial. Is the cost side outweighing the benefit side? So I think on the benefit side, we have to say the Caribbean has benefited from some huge infrastructure development projects, such as road networks, which might not have taken place without the Chinese bilateral agreements with the region. One example is the North-South Highway in Jamaica, which is over 400 million, some say up to $700 million project, started by a French company, but abandoned by them and finished by the Chinese. And this has really opened up the country a lot. Even in terms of agriculture, an area which we haven't seen very much in foreign investment in. China has the Chinese Pan-Caribbean Sugar Company from Complant has taken over the sugar industry in Jamaica. So I think that's really an important part of the relationship. I would also say that technology is one of the areas that has been growing in importance, and Alexander mentioned that. And if you look at Huawei, which in itself has become something of a controversial question and a controversial organization, Huawei is present in Jamaica and in other parts of the Caribbean and is distributing equipment, I think, again, to the benefit of the Caribbean, because the Caribbean needs to diversify the sources of technology that it takes in. I think on the other side of the coin, some people have spoken about debt trap diplomacy, and this personified by the Belt and Road Initiative, which 10 Caribbean countries have signed up to. And this is the concern that China may end up owning strategic assets if countries default on their debt. This actually has been amply researched by a number of different writers and experts, one of them being the UK's Chatham House, another being a couple of authors who wrote a book called BRI's Debt Trap Diplomacy, Reality or Myth. And the general consensus is that this is really not such an issue. However, there are instances where China has ended up owning strategic assets. So it's a nuanced situation. I would say there are also some mutterings about unfair working practices, whether some Chinese companies, particularly construction companies, have duty-free advantages, whether the playing field is level or not with local contractors, whether there is transfer of technology, overuse of Chinese manual labor to the detriment of local employment, and the environmental impact on some of the investments that they are undertaking. I think on this point, and we can discuss this further, but there really needs to be stronger negotiation, I think, on the part of the government, the construction industry, and the trade unions to mitigate some of these. What is interesting is how the relationship is evolving. A couple of things that I would highlight. One is that there's a new 450 million luxury residential project in Montego Bay in Jamaica called the Pinnacle, which is going to be huge and which can revolutionize the real estate luxury end of the market in Jamaica. And it's very interesting to see how that evolves. It's early days yet. We are seeing somewhat of a decline in value, and I experienced this while I was at Jampro, in terms of the types of investment and the value of investment rather, which was averaging 14.2 billion a year and has gone down to about 6.4 billion in 2022. And I think this is really showing that Chinese FDI is really focusing on narrowing its the sectors of interest to what they call new infrastructure, which is more like telecoms, fintech, and energy, also similar to what Alexander was mentioning. And China has its own economic challenges, which may also limit some of what they're doing. I think my final word is really that the risk for the Caribbean is that we will need to be increasingly subtle and nuanced in how we balance the world between global superpowers and not get caught up in the tensions and trade wars and trade issues between global superpowers, which can pull the Caribbean in different directions. And we have seen what happened with Huawei in Europe. We have seen the current situation with TikTok in the US. And so there is definitely a need for caution and for diplomacy in this regard. However, I think in the final analysis, there are huge opportunities for deepening trade and tourism and technology with China. And we really just need to, as the Caribbean, look at broadening and strengthening our relationships with a variety of countries, and China being one of them. So I leave it there because time limited, but look forward to the questions very much so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Those are hugely helpful comments, and I think very thought-provoking, forward-looking, and ideally will prompt some questions in the Q&A. Please do, for our audience, put your questions in using the Q&A format, and we'll address those in just a moment. Before we do, and I think this just sort of, in many ways, is a continuation of Diane's points. I mean, I'm interested really in Alexander, in your observations and those of your colleagues that have been digging so deep into this research for so long, and observing the trends on a sort of case-by-case basis and over time, temporally. I mean, a lot of my questions are about, I think, the evolution of this relationship, how it's changing over time, and then distinctions within the region itself. And so, I mean, just as a bit of, for those who may not follow the Latin American and Caribbean dynamic and China's engagement with it all that closely, what we've seen in Latin America, right? And I'm curious whether this is the case in the Caribbean too, or you view it to be, looking at this data, Alexander. What we see in Latin America and in the China-Latin America dynamic are three things that I talk about frequently, right? We've seen, on the one hand, a sort of tapering, economic tapering, so less overall economic engagement. That's, of course, collectively, whether we're talking about trade, whether we're talking about, investment, FDI, foreign direct investment, or whether we're talking about finance. And so trade has continued to grow really everywhere. And I assume, as you mentioned, right, that's also the case to some degree in the Caribbean, with a lot of that being Chinese exports to the Caribbean of a wider range of often high-tech goods now, right, as you mentioned. But we've seen a real drop off, as Diane mentioned, right, in finance. That's not really been as much of the story now, more so in the Caribbean than in other parts of the world, right? But it's still there too. The loans are smaller, they're less forthcoming. We don't see the big policy banks as active as they have been in the past. And then investment too, in terms of value, has decreased. But we've seen a lot more focusing of investments on smaller projects that are innovation related, right? And related specifically to those sectors that China is, really prioritizing at home in order to be able to grow at moderate rates in the coming years. So it's been, for example, solar, wind, batteries, EVs, things of that nature, but also telecommunications, urban infrastructure, things of this nature. And so that's been largely the story, right, in Latin America. Also in Latin America, right, we've seen this explosion of people-to-people activity that's grown over time, and even during the pandemic to a certain degree. And that can include anything from cultural activities to technical exchange, to meetings with youth, parliamentary level meetings, all kinds of things happening really in all ambits, right? And real growth in that, which is people to people is as much a part of the Belt and Road Initiative as is infrastructure development. So it's all this connectivity enhancing work. And then in other parts of Latin America, just as you mentioned, Alexander, we saw a surge in health-related activity during the pandemic, but that has had, implications post-pandemic too, wherein you have research facilities, you have new forms of engagement, and you have a real focus on pharmaceuticals and wide-ranging other sectors, economic sectors that were of focus before, but are of more focus now. And so, I think my question is kind of, is this the story as you see it in the Caribbean, or are we seeing major differences? And then if I could just I'll let you answer that, but I have a few observations maybe on major differences too, which I hope you'll correct and Diane will correct,
Sure.
because I'm getting to the bottom of whether the Caribbean is all that different from everywhere else, the trends that is or not, I think is a really critical part of this discussion. Yeah.
Well, see, I think if you want to really understand the logic of China's engagement strategy, I think it really boils down to where where their offerings generally to the world can overlap with the needs of Caribbean policymakers at the time. I mean, if you think about it this way, the CARICOM is, with few exceptions, the CARICOM region is a region of muted economic growth. Let's put it that way. Not a region where you have high levels of economic growth. Jamaica in particular averages a growth rate of about, I mean, I don't quote me exactly, but about 1% per year or thereabouts. Diane can correct me if I'm wrong. And one of the key things that has held back economic growth is the infrastructure deficit. And that is the lack of highways, lack of, this comes up again, but things like rail transport, mass transportation, particularly highways and connectivity and a well-maintained infrastructure over the region. And then that's before you even get into marine infrastructure, there's also a noticeable deficit, which is ironic considering that we are mostly island countries. So that is an easy area for the Chinese engagement to start and dominating, because the kinds of terms they're offering in terms of loans, the CARICOM leaders find it much more favorable than, or tend to find it more favorable than loans and the terms that would come from loans from the international institutions such as the World Bank, the IFC, those kinds of like Bretton Woods institutions. And so that's the logic there. It's very simple. So there's this huge gap in terms of infrastructure need in the region. Chinese are very good at those. They have special state-owned enterprises that have a lot of experience in delivering those goods, that infrastructure at a low cost and with favorable terms. And so you see that now, but there's going to be a natural taper off in that, because if Jamaica really needs highways, it needs a north-south highway, it needs a south-south highway. The amount of highways it's going to need over time is going to diminish. And there's the deficits of ports, you're going to see investments in the ports, but the amount of that infrastructure gap does get smaller and smaller over time. So you're going to see that diminish. The next gap is in digital transformation. We're moving towards a digital world. We're firmly in a digital world, but what CARICOM countries, a lot of them have felt left behind, and this is necessary to achieve. That is also a form of infrastructure that is necessary to stay competitive in the global world. So that's another gap that the Chinese have sought to fill, and that is probably more expansive in terms of you can expand digital. You'll see less of a natural taper off effect because of the almost infinite need for digital solutions. But then it also gets into the realm of controversy, because for example, the previous ambassador under the previous U.S. ambassador to Jamaica under the previous Trump administration, he was very insistent. Like he came with a mission. It's like he to sound the alarm on Chinese pushing into the realm of digital infrastructure in Jamaica. I'm sure it was the same in other CARICOM countries. So it runs into this kind of diplomatic hurdle where China wants to, especially through companies like Huawei, want to get plugged in more into our digital critical infrastructure and at the ground level, and that comes up against the U.S.-China relationship, and that's a whole. We could have a whole other panel on that on that. But so you have this natural. So you kind of do see this tapering off, but some of it is explained by the natural closing of the gaps in certain areas, and it's also explained by this data again ends in 2023. You're going to see some natural tapering off because of the kind of locking down of the world during the relative locking down of the world during the pandemic. But but the Chinese strategy is to seek out those gaps. It's a very entrepreneurial strategy. Let's put it that way. They're trying to see what the CARICOM region needs and trying to fill those needs with their solutions. And there doesn't seem to be a decrease in the appetite for on the parts of CARICOM countries to resist that, because we want to catch up. We want to catch up, and we'll partner with whoever's giving us the best offer. That's expensive.
Margaret, if I may, I just want to make a couple more comments on that question of tapering, because I think we're really seeing two waves. So the first wave was very much exuberance and very much large projects, particularly in Jamaica, which has seen the biggest chunk of the 10 billion the Chinese have invested in the region. We are at about 3.16, I think, in Jamaica. And one of those reasons was because of the investments, for instance, in the agriculture, in the port, and in a huge alumina plant. But then you saw that actually a lot of those investments have not really been hugely profitable. And so I think you are part of the reason you are seeing this tapering and looking at smaller investments is partly because of that, and also because of China's internal challenges. So you will see continued FDI in some of those areas, but the projects will certainly become smaller and are becoming smaller. I think on the infrastructure, you are seeing a lot more operations there, and that will continue because of the advantages I spoke of in the construction industry. And I think the other point I would make, and I fully agree with Alexander, that the Chinese have been extremely entrepreneurial in targeting the areas where they really can help. But I think I would also point out that Jamaica has actually refused loans, additional loans from China, particularly because we're very concerned with reducing our debt to GDP ratio. So there are, this is a nuanced relationship, and I think the Chinese have been able to respect some of the constraints under which we're operating. Thanks.
Yes, and on that point, I mean, things are changing, right? You sort of mentioned a moment of exuberance, right? Or euphoria. People have called it sino-euphoria, right? Which really corresponded, in my view, with the height of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? 2015, 2016, when there were a lot of infrastructure projects, a lot of announcements, a lot of movement, tons of loans, right? Finance coming from all different directions. We're in a very different moment now. And so I think this tool will be absolutely fundamental looking ahead as we try to understand, where those gaps are. First of all, that the Caribbean is identifying and wants to engage China on, because, as you mentioned, Diane, Jamaica has made very different decisions about finance in recent years than it has had, 10 years ago. And so we are in a different moment in thinking about how to engage China, right? This is true globally. It's true certainly in Latin America, and I think in the Caribbean it's no different. But this is also a very different moment for China in terms of what it can bring to the table, and is willing to bring to the table. And so the sorts of large-scale construction projects that were a feature of this relationship, 10 years ago, or even more recently in certain cases, will they be as forthcoming, even though this gap persists, right? Alexander, as you mentioned, maybe closing to a degree, but persists in a major way. Will they be as forthcoming as other types of projects? And certainly digitalization is a big agenda for China, and exportation of goods and services related to that is a top priority. So I could imagine major movement in that space. But regardless, this sort of determination of where are the gaps, where are the mutual understanding of the gaps, and where that all comes, how that plays out will be a fundamental research question for all of us looking ahead, and one that this tool can really help to determine, to shed some light on, I think, moving.
Margaret, if I may, add one important point. I mean, we have to remember that this is the China CARICOM dashboard, but we left out 5 countries.
Right.
That's important. That's important because these 5 countries do not have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, because they don't recognize it. They recognize the Republic of China, and that's important because each individual CARICOM country is quite small. It's a small market, and if you really want to be for another stage of exuberance, another big push to expand the investment in the region, you would have to be able to combine have the CARICOM market as kind of one, but that makes things tricky, because they can't have diplomatic relations with Belize, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, a few of these others, Haiti, where there are many gaps to fill. I mean, and so the CARICOM region has been working on this closer integration of their economy to moving towards what we call a single market economy for decades now. And if you want to, for our own benefit, but if you're an outside player and you want to thrive in the region, you want to thrive in that combined market, you're going to hit stumbling blocks if you don't have diplomatic relations with all the CARICOM countries. And so potential projects include infrastructure and particularly maritime infrastructure, marine infrastructure that provides greater connectivity between the islands. Well, that's just seems like that just runs into diplomatic issues, if you understand what I'm saying.
That makes sense. Alexander, we have a couple of questions about the functionality of the tool and your methodology in the Q&A, and if I might pose those very quickly. First of all, how often or frequently will the portal be updated with I'll just give all of these to you, and then you can answer in order. Be updated with new data. What are the plans for keeping it up to date?
Okay.
And are there plans to do some comparative work? For example, this is on China, CARICOM. Can we expect anything on other countries, relations, economic and diplomatic, and investment, other relations with the CARICOM countries, or else some comparative analysis coming out of CAPRI that would help us to understand, how China's role compares to that of other major partners in the Caribbean. And then another from Zara Albright, on infrastructure investments here are listed under both trade and diplomacy subcategories. What's the difference between which projects or investments would be included in one or other subcategories? Or how does one distinguish between?
Well, you'd have to go into those the final data points, but it's going to be explained by the project description, because you do see this blending. You do see this blending sometimes. Is an engagement more of a diplomatic engagement but we kind of break them. So sometimes we would have a kind of a meeting between a ministerial meeting, whether in China or in Jamaica, to discuss a certain infrastructure investment. And then we'll have that to be a separate diplomatic entry, a separate entry in terms of diplomacy from when the actual investment materializes. And so we try to have some entries you'll see kind of doubled, but it will be reflected as both trade and diplomacy in separate entries. That you'll see that sometimes. And in terms of updating the data, well, this goes to 2023. because we finished this kind of research last in, kind of the granular research last year before 2024 it ended. And so we're kind of due for an update this year to include the 2024 data. This will be probably, this can be finished by summer, if but according to our own internal research schedule. And I'm sorry, I forgot the third question.
And then the other
Right.
was updating, and then
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
they have perspective. Mhm.
Okay, yes. So I mean, CAPRI and IID has a research project coming out on, particularly with regards to the climate related projects in CARICOM. We're looking forward to contributing our 2 cents to that and what we've learned from the data. This will when the Inter-American Dialogue approached us about doing this kind of research project, we kind of thought for a while, so where do we start with this? Because we don't have, and realized that there isn't a good picture of the trends in Chinese engagement in region. And so we thought the first place to start is to have just to do that baseline analysis, to gather all of that together, because it didn't exist in one place. You do have China aid data globally around the world, but in terms of updates and granular information, that we had to do a whole lot of interviews with people and on the investigative work to kind of fill the details of that data. And from now, it provides us a jumping off point to do further research in those areas if the opportunity presents itself to do that further analysis. But yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you for the plug also, Alexander. Yes, we'll be
Yeah.
together to produce a
Good
comparative
shit.
analysis of Chinese and then other partner engagement in the climate cooperation space, understanding that any climate cooperation is critical at this juncture, right? But that there are different approaches that need to be understood in order to maximize the benefits and value of what everyone is doing together, and ideally leverage what limited assets there are to achieve wide-ranging objectives. We have a question about, and I would love for both of you to respond to this if you're willing, about the nature of the investments themselves. So trade aside, and obviously some of these investments are promoting of trade, but trade aside, the projects, right? The projects that we've seen over the years, which have ranged from large scale infrastructure with equity investment, right? Others are just construction projects where companies come in, they build things and they leave. And then wide ranging other investments too, right? That are documented in this tool. Are these handled largely by Caribbean contractors or Chinese contractors? So this is a labor question. This is one that has surfaced, especially in the context of the Caribbean, more so than anywhere else in the hemisphere, right? And do the contracts lead to domestic growth, economic growth in most cases, or do you view these investments as largely, benefiting China in whatever form as a result of export promotion, or bringing in labor, or whatever the conditions may be for the project in question? Obviously, I assume this varies considerably on an investment by investment basis, but I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on this question, which is one that surfaces quite frequently.
I mean, I think I would love to hear what Margaret has to say first. So somebody who's been on the front lines of those engagements. Sorry. What Diane has to say. Diane.
I'm happy to
No, sorry.
comment.
Sure.
Diane.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that there are two sides to it. One, there is certainly an element of you could call it crowding out of the local contractors, because you have some big Chinese contractors, and I would say they pretty much cornered the market on all the large scale high-rise developments over the last 10 years. And this partly because of their superior equipment, their financial advantages, because they can bring low-cost loans to the table, and long-term low-cost loans, and a lot of equipment and very modern equipment. So they really have cornered the market on both private sector and public sector high-rise construction. I think, and then the road construction also, they have been very successful in. The local people have, through the Master Builders Association, raised quite a lot of hue and cry about this, although local companies have benefited from subcontracts. So there has been some amount of subcontracting, and the government has negotiated for a higher percentage of local labor on these sites. So it's not all, one side or the other. And I would say, I saw the question in the Q&A there that the question of remittances and financial drain or FX, foreign exchange drain, doesn't really come up because most of these workers, Chinese workers, would be paid back in their home countries. So there wouldn't be a foreign exchange deficit on the Jamaican side. So I would say there could certainly be a lot more transfer of technology, because that is one of the criticisms. We don't see enough of that happening, enough training of local workers. And that's something that the government is more and more insisting on. And so I think it will become more of a feature in future projects.
Thank you so much, Diane. That's hugely helpful. Another question, this is a sort of a forward-looking one, and then I have a potentially final question if we don't have any more in the Q&A. But Shea Williams, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, apologies if not, notes that this is an important tool to educate the public and ensure transparency. Are there other ways, right, that Caribbean actors in various forms or broader research institutions can work together or independently to really communicate clearly what are the trends underway in the China-Caribbean dynamic? And, if I might add to that, if you had to set out a sort of research question, right, Alexandra, having done this, in-depth analysis for a number of months and years now, and then, Diane having witnessed, so much of this activity for many years, what would it be? I mean, what do you see are the gaps, right, that we still need to fill in terms of the China-Caribbean relationship in particular?
Well, your previous question highlights an interesting research question, is that how much have each of these, or the totality of these infrastructure projects, contributed to the economic development of the region, because that's the rationale behind them, right? So the highways are supposed to in Jamaica are supposed to add greater connectivity between towns in Jamaica. The ports investments are supposed to increase trade. I think an interesting piece of research would delve into would actually investigate and try to determine how much economic value these projects have actually added to the economic growth. Jamaica, we haven't seen a great degree of economic growth overall, everything, but we don't know what our GDP growth last year would have been like without the highway. These are some of the counterfactual questions, but a good economic research program would delve into that and see what have these contributed to the region, the level of economic growth, and each country's economic growth. That would be interesting. In terms of, I think, to do research on the kind of digital transformation side, I think we need a few more years of gathering that to see what progress they have made on that front. But we have enough examples and data and years on the construction of land-based and marine infrastructure projects. I think that could form the basis of a good research program.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with that, actually, because I think looking at some of the infrastructure, I don't think we have really analyzed the economic impact. So if you take a road like the North-South Highway, obviously reducing transit time, reducing the cost of moving products from one side of the island to the other, that's going to have a huge economic impact. But I don't think we have properly researched that. So that's something that I think in future would be a very useful research project. I think in terms of where the gaps still lie, I think digital transformation and technology and R&D, research and development, those are areas which are underinvested in the Caribbean big time, and where I think China's technology can really fill a gap. Education and skills development, which is kind of where I work now, I think that is a real opportunity for more collaboration. So the University of the West Indies has an agreement with Suzhou in China to do technology training of some of our graduates. But I think, again, this is an area that could be expanded quite a lot. And then renewable energy, which I know has become a fraught topic. But I think when you talk about resource poor islands, which most Caribbean islands are, you know, the whole question of renewable energy and how we upweight renewable energy and include more renewables onto the grid. I mean, Jamaica has a plan to get to 50% of the grid being serviced by renewable energy as opposed to heavy fuel oil. Barbados is in a similar position. I think they even want to go beyond 50%. So I think this is an area where Chinese experience and expertise can be hugely helpful.
And if I might add to the renewable energy point, the this is not just a push for more of a green economy. There's a strong business case for renewable energy in the Caribbean because of the high cost of electricity. This is something that some of the audience members not external to the region might not know, but the cost of energy in Jamaica is extremely high, among the highest in the world. And so there is one of those gaps that is just, I think the Chinese are going into more because it's there to be filled, and the Chinese have made advancements particularly in solar energy, but other renewables as well. That I think there are a lot of Jamaican stakeholders, and I imagine across the Caribbean, that really would seek to benefit from that to bring down the cost of living in these countries.
And as a factor of economic
Yes.
competitiveness, it's the most important factor.
Yes, exactly.
If I could, I realize we have only about 2 minutes left, but if I could ask you, just as we look kind of geographically across the Caribbean or across CARICOM countries that recognize, the People's Republic, I wonder where you maybe see more focus or less focus looking ahead, right? I mean, certainly Jamaica has been a top recipient of Chinese attention in various forms over the years, a sort of hub for Chinese activity in the Caribbean. Trinidad, too, to a degree, it even has its own special characterization in terms of Chinese diplomacy. But there are other actors as well, and you've mentioned a few. Guyana, Suriname have been. We've seen more engagement there of late, and then other countries you've mentioned that there have been ups and downs, right? Real fluctuations in terms of Chinese economic engagement at the very least. Do you anticipate, looking ahead, geographically speaking, right, any shifts in this dynamic, or any areas of focus sort of growing in the past few months or years?
Well, I think Jamaica has been the greatest recipient of like that of the engagement, China's increased engagement in the region, and a little far behind them, Guyana and Suriname. But I think that's going to be the biggest shift, personally, because everybody's interested in Guyana these days, and I don't think China's any different. But also, diplomatically, I think it's clear that Suriname has the closest diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China that isn't reflected in a level of investment that's as high as Jamaica, but given the finds of natural resources off the coast of both Guyana and Suriname, I think there's that what they call Guyana Shield. That region is going to receive a lot more attention going forward. I think they have, these are large countries, larger than in terms of landmass, relatively large compared to all the Caribbean islands, but very underpopulated. I mean, Guyana only has, I don't even think they've reached 800,000 people yet. and Suriname has a bit, I think 400,000 people, that much. So very underpopulated, but rich in natural resources, rich in strategic positioning in the Atlantic. I think they're going to I think the smaller islands are going to continue to receive like fluctuating investments here and there. I don't see potential for a lot of growth in that relationship, but Guyana, Suriname.
Yeah, very interesting.
Um,
Be interesting to see how the
yeah,
financial relationship plays out with
yeah,
Suriname as well
yeah,
and within that
yeah.
context. Diane, would you agree or
Yeah, I
any?
would agree, Guyana, Suriname, because of the oil and gas. And I think, interestingly, the citizenship by investment has been a big pull for Chinese investors. And if they were to set up something similar, you would see a big rush over there. The smaller islands will continue to benefit from those programs. I think we'll also see in Jamaica some more Chinese private sector investment. And it's going to be interesting to see the evolution of the private sector in China, because that Pinnacle investment that I spoke about is not a Chinese state-owned company. It's a Chinese private investor. And that's going to be interesting to see in the future how that evolves, whether China will crack down further on capital exports, or whether the the Communist Party in China will try to restrain any export controls or exchange controls on China. So I think there's going to be an interesting period in the next period. And then, as I said, the geopolitical constraints that may come with the new period that we're living through, with our major partner in tourism, in trade, in investment, which is the US. So that's a new factor in the relationship, which is going to direct and in some cases constrain how the relationship develops. So we'll see.
Certainly a critical development and something we'll all be monitoring very closely looking ahead. I think also a good note to end on. We have reached the conclusion of the event. I can't thank you all enough for joining us. Many thanks to our wonderful panelists and presenters, Alexander, Diane, thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to using this tool and also to continuing this conversation in the future. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful
Thank
day.
you.